Greetings, viewers, and welcome to our Sage 200 Budgets webinar. Today's webinar will be covering the following: an introduction to budgets, the importance of budgets, over and under budgeting, the input of budget information, projects linked to budgets, the importing of budget information, processing of transactions within Sage 200 which are linked to budgets, budget validations, budget reports, and Capex budgets. Now, before we start, I think it's important to understand the importance of budgeting within any organization. So in any organization, you're going to have funds coming into the business through income, and you're then also going to have funds leaving the business via expenses, etc. So it's important to budget for your income as well as your expenses to ensure that you've got a good cash flow within the organization. And today we're going to be seeing how important it is and how easy it is to set up your budgets within Sage 200 Evolution. Now, I think we've all heard of instances where you have budgeting or over budgeting, which means that people have exceeded their budget, okay? Which in actual fact in some instances can be a bad thing and can be a good thing. A typical example where, for example, if you've got expenses and you've over budgeted for expenses, which means that you've budgeted or you've spent more than what you've budgeted for. On the other hand, if it's, for example, your sales and you've over budgeted, it's really a good thing, which means that you've actually sold more than what you budgeted for. So over and under budgeting can have different meanings depending on if it's an income or an expense within your organization. Right, so to get started, we're going to go into our evolution. And if you look at budgets, you can find them under General Ledger, Maintenance, Projects, Budget, and Project Budgets. Okay, so it's simply a case of going in there, selecting a range of accounts or a specific account, specifying a financial year, and then from there going to go and insert your budget information. So I'm just going to use one account. Let's just say, for example, training account. And I'm now going to insert my budget details for my current financial year. So I'm just going to insert or specify my financial year. I've got my range of accounts there and say view. So I've got a breakdown of my financial year per financial period. And now it's simply a case of going to the budget column and specifying the value of the budget for that particular period within my financial year. So I'm going to be inputting these figures, and then I can obviously do comparisons through the financial year or during the financial year for my relevant periods. Right, so it tells me that there's a breakdown by financial period and that my total budget for that training account is going to be that value. And you'll see that we've got the ability to also enter forecast figures. So if need be, I can also generate some forecast figures. And once that's done, I've got columns which will show me my actual expenditure, which would be details of the actual transaction values for that account for the period. And then the different variances between actual versus budget, as well as a various percentage. And if I did have a budget figure for the previous financial year, it'll also give me a breakdown of variances, percentages and values, etc. for the previous financial year, which is always great if you're going to be comparing, for example, your current progress to your progress in the previous financial year. Right, so it's a case of inserting those details, saving it, and you're good to go. Right, so as you can see, it's a process where I'm capturing the figures, but as you can imagine is that if you've got a multitude of accounts, it may take quite a process to go capture that information. Right, what we also have is ability to a couple of options with regards to entering or amending figures. And what we can do here is click on the edit button, specify our financial period, and we are then able to go and change the figure. So for example, I may need to go and change or amend a particular budget figure for whatever reason. I can simply go and insert the details there and say OK there. However, it's important to understand that the system needs me to insert a reason why the budget value is being changed. So I've made the changes and I simply need to go and insert a reason why the existing figure has been changed. So insert the reason and you're good to go. Update those details and that figure has now changed. Right, we also have the ability to update in certain options. For example, we can update as a percentage or update as a batch. And what I'm going to be doing now is I'm just going to cancel this for the minute, and I'm going to go add a new budget, this time for an income account. And you can see exactly, obviously, we've got our expenses, and then we're going to be using also budget for an income account. So there we go. Once again, those details. Right, so I've got my details there and I'm just going to save it. Now, important to understand is that if I go to edit, as I mentioned, we can update as a percentage or update as a batch. So with regards to our percentage, it certainly means is that if you think of a scenario where maybe you've got an agreement that maybe lasts for a couple of periods and that there's a set percentage update based on the terms and conditions of their contract. So what I can do is I can simply say on that particular period, I can insert a value and say update as a percentage, and we're good to go. Right, so it's going to go take the 30% of that value and insert those details here. Now, if we just go back to our editing option, as you can see, we can set a budget figure, we can add to a value or subtract. So, for example, if I'm going to take that value, I can say add and insert my details there. And we're good to go. And then I can also use the subtract option. Right, so all ways that I can go change those existing budget figures if I need to. Right, then it's going to go add another one, and let's just go and make use of a very typical example. For example, rent. So rent is normally going to be a fixed amount every month. So I'm just going to go, I've got my details here. Just going to add a value and say save it. And if I go back to edit, you'll see that I can use the update as a batch option. So I'm just going to go through to my first period within the financial year. There we go. Insert my details. Let's just make this, there's been a change. So I'm going to say update as a batch. Specify which period, the first period or selected period. And if I say OK there, you see I can update all those fields simultaneously. So that's a very useful feature if you know that the budget amount is going to be the same for all the periods within your financial year. Right, then we also have the ability to copy a budget. So for example, I'm now going to set up that option here, and I'm just going to specify year 2 and year 3 to display. Right, there we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the copy option. So I'm going to say copy the budget value, and I can specify from a financial year to this particular year. I'm just going to make a quick change. I'm going to actually go to year 3 because I'm then going to copy year 2's figures, year 3. So I'm simply going to say copy the budget values from financial year 2 to financial year 3, and I'm going to use the set option. I could also use add as a percentage if I wanted to, if there is going to be an increase as a percentage value in the coming financial year. Right, so okay there, and there we go. So now I've copied the budget figures from my current financial year to the new financial year. Also can be used if you're doing budget for the current financial year. You can always just copy those figures from the prior year, and you've got the information there ready created for you. So a very useful feature to have. Right, always important that you need to save the changes once you've made them so that they are available. And as you can see, there's a whole range of options that can be used to enter budget figures. However, you can imagine that if you've got a whole range of GL accounts, it may be quite a process to capture all those values one by one. So we therefore have the ability to import budget figures. And this can be done in 2 ways. You can use 2 options. It is the data import export facility within Sage Evolution. So it's simply a case of creating a file together with your budget details and using the data import facility to import those figures into Evolution based on your budget information. The other option which we're going to be looking at today is called the data distribution services, which also allows you to import information into your program via CSV file. So to do that, we're going to go to an application called Data Distribution Services, and it's an application which runs outside of Evolution. And if you go to your program install directory, you'll find an option that says Evolution DDS. Now, when Evolution is installed, you have the option to select or deselect the installation of DDS. So obviously you decide if you want to make use of it. So I'm going to open up my data distribution services, which I have done so already. I'm just going to minimize that. Let's just go back in there. Right, and what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating an import template to be used to import our information. So it's quite simple. Just go to the new option, and we're going to say, where is this import currently situated? So there are a couple of options there. In this case, I'm going to use ASCII because it's an ASCII file that's going to be used to import those details. ASCII, there we go. And then next, and then just need to say exactly what it is you're going to be importing. In this case, it's going to be budgets and project budgets. So there we go. Now the package is where is information going to be imported into. So once again, I can browse and I can say Evolution, and we're done. Right, so now there comes the option where we need to configure and ensure the mappings and everything is correct between the import file and the data distribution services. So there's a couple of options there. First, you're going to go to a publisher, and what I've done in the meantime is I've gone to go create a CSV file, which contains my budget information to be imported. It's really just a simple CSV file consisting of 3 columns, which is the budget or the account number needs to be updated, the budget period for the financial period of my relevant year, as well as the amount of the budget for the particular period. Right, so I'm just going to say, just go change this and make it, for example, telephone account. Right, and then I can just copy that down to the other options. And let's just go save that. Right, so my CSV file is up and running. Got my 3 columns. Back to data distribution services. And as I mentioned, there's a couple of options that need to be configured. So under Publisher, we're going to go to Publisher 2 of 2. And this is really where the mapping or the configuration occurs between the data distribution services and your import file. So you see that we've got a couple of options here which are grayed out, not accessible. This indicates that these are columns that are compulsory and need to be included in your import file in order for you to import the information. So in this case, obviously the compulsory fields are ledger account, together budget, period, date, and we now need to map them to correspond with the layout of our import file. So back to our file, account number is column 1, period is column 2, and amount is column 3. And we'll just go configure that. So what we're saying is that ledger account is the first column. So move that up to the first position. Period date is second on our spreadsheet. So it's going to go to position number 2. And the other field we're going to be making use of is budget, which is the amount. So tick on the box. And we're going to move that up to position number 3. Down a bit. Okay. So as you can see, those 3 columns correspond to my import file in the same positioning, and that seems to be good to go. And then just under our Publisher 1 of 2, we now need to go specify the file name to be imported. So just go browse for the file. Right, there we go. It's a CSV file, no problem there. And specifying if the file has the header record or not. Obviously, the system needs to know that doesn't start importing from row 1 or row 2 simply because it's a header record. And then just details about the field delimiter, the date format, etc., if it's applicable. Right, so next we go to our subscriber, and we're going to be specifying the Evolution SQL Server details together with the database into which the information is going to be imported. And obviously using connection, depending if you're using a Windows NT or an SQL Server authentication connection there. Right, so database, and let's just go and find the database. There we go. Right, everything's in order there, and we're good to go. So once again, just a confirmation, Publisher 1 of 2 is specifying the import file together with the details about the file. Publisher 2 of 2, just the mapping and configuration of the DDS so it conforms to the file layout. Subscriber, we're specifying the SQL Server details. And under Subscriber 2 of 2, we're just specifying how do you want to handle those records that's being imported. Update all the records, append new records, and edit existing records, etc. Right, so we're good to go. Right, so I'm just going to go back into Evolution, and if I go back to my budgets, we're in there. We're going to go look at the budget for the telephone account. Okay, for the current financial year. View that. Right, there are no figures there, which is great because we're now going to be importing them via the DDS. So, 2 very important things is I'm just going to exit and log off, close the program before the import is being done. And very importantly, I'm just going to make sure, it's very vital, that the import file that you're going to be using is in fact closed before I import it. Let's just close that file, no problem there. And obviously very important, have the users exit the application before the import is being done, have a backup, etc. And as I mentioned, make sure that the import file is in fact closed. Right, so we're good to go. Highlight my template, and we can say run now. And if you look at the bottom, you may have missed it. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, It's just going to display the number of records that are being imported as the process unfolds. Right, so that seems to have gone through correctly. However, we can confirm that the import success by going to the View Log File option on the top of the screen, View Log File, and it's just going to give us a breakdown of exactly what the import entailed. So it tells me that it went to this particular server. You've got the details there. That was what was imported, and the number of records that have been processed successfully or imported. Okay. Obviously, if there were perhaps some form of problem or perhaps a configuration issue, you would pick up those details on your log file. Right, so everything went through correctly, it seems. And now we're going to log into Evolution and check out the import that we've just completed. Right, so in we go. Check out the budgets, and we can see the figures that have been imported. Right, so just going to budgets and project budgets. I'm going to go find the telephone account. There we go. For that year. Congratulations, you've imported your budgets via data distribution services. So very quick and easy, a real option if you are going to be importing large amounts of budgets. The data distribution services can be used very efficiently for that purpose. Right, quite simple. Now, just reverting back to data distribution services, as you can see, it keeps a template here. So, for example, if I need to import additional budget information, just go to my properties, and then the template is there already. I can just, for example, maybe change the file location or change the file that's being imported. I can perhaps change the mapping if I need to add additional fields, etc. So, as you can see, you create the template once off, and it can be used for subsequent imports if required. Right, so back into budgets, we'll see that the option really is for budgets and project budgets. So we can then link budgets to various projects. So you as an organization may be dealing with various projects. You want to keep track of the budget for that information, and we can then use that. So we're just going to go back into our common module, and we're just going to see a couple of options there. So under projects, I've set up a couple of projects there, which I'm now going to be linking budget for. So for example, think of a construction organization. They've got different construction projects happening, and they want to just keep tabs on the budget for those projects to make sure that they are working within their budget restraints. Right, so back to budgets, and I'm going to go this time link into a project. So let's just go, for example, there, and I'm going to go to, let's just say, for example, general expenses. Right, and then I'm going to say projects, that project, and then just on my current financial year. Right, so I'm going to view that, and then once again, I'm just going to use, in this case, the update as a batch option. Right, so there we go. That's for my one particular project. And then I'm also now going to say general expenses, but now link that to a different project. And view, and then I'm also going to just use the update as batch option there. Right, so as you can see, I can link one GL account to multiple project budgets, and then obviously based on my reporting, I can keep track of how my budget is processing based on a particular project. Right, So while I'm here, I'm just going to create just a new budget for a new account. Let's just make it, for example, marketing, which we'll be using when we make use of our transactions. Right, so that's been resolved. So the important thing to remember is that we're now going to be processing transactions based on budgets. And if I then, for example, just go through to my inventory, I can just do a quick GRV, supply invoice, and then we can see how the budgets are going to come into play. Okay, so it's your goods received voucher, and I'm going to specify a normal GRV supply invoice there. This time for a GL account. And let's just go down. Right, there's marketing, and we're good to go. Now, you are able to view the budget details of a particular account on the processing screen, really in two ways. You can go to the line option and say budget query, okay? And the system then brings up the GL account, if there's a project linked or not, the relevant period that you're processing the transaction in, and if there's going to be a budget, yes or no, for that particular period. So just take, for example, the telephone one, and let's just go update that. Right, so it tells me that currently now the budget for the period is 4,800. Nothing has actually been spent because there's been no transactions. So I've still got the full value available for processing within the period. And then tells me that annually, this is my budget annually, and then I've still got everything available. The useful option here is that I can also see unprocessed PO balances. So I may have processed a purchase order for a specific account. However, the order has been processed, but the goods have not yet been received or delivered. So therefore, it's an unprocessed PO. I can still see what the value is for this unprocessed purchase orders on a particular account. Right, so there we go. We know that it's 4,800 is the value. Let's just say, for example, we're going to process that transaction. And process the invoice for that value. Right, so now if I go back to my supply invoice, I'm going to get another invoice for that item. And once again, as I mentioned, we can use two options. The one being you can go to the line option, or else you can use the Alt plus B option there in order to display your budget information. So either go to line and view, or use a shortcut keys of being Alt and B. So as you can see, it's now updated. It tells me that so far I spent that value, and I can still spend 900 within that particular period. And then also it's been updated based on my annual budget. Right, so there we go. And we're good to go. Process invoice. Right. So you may think that obviously in certain instances you may not want to allow the processing of transactions if they're going to exceed the budget. So yes, we have a budget validation option that takes care of that particular matter. And we need to do a couple of things before we make use of it. So firstly, under our general ledger defaults, we've got the option to validate budgets on supply invoices. So if I go in there, it tells me supplier document budget validation. Click on that box. And what you'll see is we can make use of, for example, annual budget or monthly budget. So you may, for example, you've set up a budget for your financial period. However, you will allow, for example, the various departments and cost centers to exceed their budget for a particular month. However, they may not exceed it for a specific annual budget. Okay, so it's not a case of they can spend or exceed the budget within the financial year, but they may not exceed the annual budget values, etc. So let's just say use annual budget. So I'm going to allow them to exceed budgets for the financial period. Right, so once you've done that, I'm going to update this information. And we now need to implement certain access permissions for the users so that they're not able to exceed the budget when processing transactions. In this case, we set that to be an annual budget. So in administration, I'm just going to go to an agent and find the agent. There we go. And under the agent's access permissions, I need to go make a couple of changes there to implement the validation. So access permissions, and under general ledger, you'll see that we've got the option for permissions. Now, there are two options that we need to look at. Firstly, it's one that says allow budget validation override. So that must obviously be deselected. And then also, very importantly, a budget supervisor. So you're going to remove those two options. So this user can obviously process supplier transactions. However, they cannot exceed the budget, etc. They need to have some form of permission or validation to occur. Right, so it's going to be sorted and updated, those two options. And I'm just going to log in as that user. And we'll just see exactly how the validation comes into play. Right, so I'm just going to log in as the user. Now we said budget is going to be based on annual amount. So we'll process a GRV with those values. Right, so I'm just going to go into our budgets first, and we're going to go see the details of the actual budget for that account. Right, so we know it's telephone account for year 2. Right, so it tells me that currently for the period, my budget was that value. The actual is that. There's a variance, that's my variance percentage, and I've got my details there. So just check what the annual budget is for that figure, for that account. Right, so I'm now going to have logged in as the agent, back to inventory. Okay, and I'm going to process a GRV supplier invoice. There we go. Right, so now I'm going to ensure that this value is going to exceed. So I'm just going to make it that value and process the transaction. Okay, so immediately the system picks up is that the value of the transaction is going to exceed my budget. So it gives me a breakdown of exactly the annual budget, the actual amount that has so far been spent, any unprocessed purchase order values, and how much is this transaction going to exceed the budget amount. Right, so you can either cancel or ignore, but if you say ignore, the system is going to prevent this transaction from happening until an administrator or budget supervisor has authorized the transaction. So now need to happen is that the admin administrator or the budget supervisor will then need to come in, insert their details and their password, and then the transaction can continue. So there we go. Let's just say okay there. Budget supervisor has overwritten this transaction and we're good to go. And the transaction can proceed. So as I say, budget validation ensures that if a transaction is going to exceed the budget, there needs to be some form of approval by a budget supervisor for the transaction to be completed. Right. So let's just go back into our budgets and let's just go check what's happened there. So back into budget and project budget values, just go to that one and view, and as you can see there's a value. So it just tells me that currently there was my budget, there's the value, and as you can see the actual has exceeded the budget value, but obviously it's been authorized by a budget supervisor. And then we've got details about the variance, various percentages, etc. Right. So just go process a transaction which is linked to a project. So I'm just going to go back to inventory and I'm going to have to do another GRV, this time to an account that links to a project budget. Right, so there we go. Okay, very important, I need to add or specify the project information there. And I do know that the account, that's my account. There we go. And if I just use the shortcut key, I can see exactly that that's my account. There's the project link, and currently now nothing has been spent, so we're okay to go. Just go, for example, say very importantly is that in this particular instance, I'm using a project per transaction. So my defaults are saying link a project to a document. However, if need be, I can also insert it or have it configured that I've actually got a project per line item. So I can specify multiple line items on this document and then link them to different projects if I'm using project per line versus project per document. Right, so that's been processed and we're just going to do another one. Okay, so everything was in order, it was below the budget value, so we're good to go. And once again, we can just check the details there. Right, so nothing at this particular time. And we're just going to say right, and we're good to go to process the transaction. Right, so as you can see, we're linking projects to GL account transactions, and then we're simply going to be processing and updating and based on our budget information. Right, so all other transactions, for example, be they customer transactions, cash book batches, GL journals, etc. If the account is effective, then it's obviously going to validate on budgets and check that the budget information is updated accordingly based on the transaction value. Now, what we do have is a range of reports that can be viewed based on projects. So under general ledger, as well as budgets, so if I go to my reports, firstly, we've got our budgets report, and we've got a few options. There are filters we can make use of. So for example, I can go and view it for a specific account. Let's just say, for example, there we go. I can say for a specific period, or if need be, I can use comparative budgets. So if I click that option, I can view it for a 12-month range. So there we go. I can preview that for that account, and it's going to give me a breakdown of the different budget values per period together with the total budget for that period. So I can obviously just check what my budget is for breakdown by financial period. If need be, I can also use the option to say budget to previous budget. Obviously, if I've got budget figures for the previous year, I can then do a comparison based on that information. So run that report, and it's obviously going to give me details for the current financial year, and blank, as I say, because no budget details have been set up for the previous financial year. Right, so if we then go to another report, which is the income statement, and what we can then do is we can also add or incorporate budget values there. So if there's a budget value, I can click on the option that says print if there's a budget value, specify my date range, preview that, and it's going to give me details about what the actual value was, etc., what the variance was if there was a budget value, etc., and then do variance percentages, etc. So as you can see, there's our actual value for that account, budget amount, the variance, etc., and just the variance percentage. So if need be, I can always go and incorporate budget information when I'm viewing my income statement report. Right, we then have project budget versus actual. Right, so if I go there, I'm just going to specify that account which is linked to my projects and my budgets, and we've got the details there. A couple of filters that you can make use of if you want to sort of filter your report based on certain parameters, and my date range, and we're good to go. Right, so as you can see, it's broken it down into my projects with the relevant information, project actual, the variance, etc., etc., and I can obviously have a breakdown per project on my GL account and just see exactly how I'm progressing. Am I within budget, over budget, etc. And then another report that we can make use of is a project profit and loss. And let's just go and change the date range slightly. Right, that looks in order. Okay. And I can obviously arrange my projects there, preview, and it's going to give me a breakdown of the actual expenditure and how the expenditure has been allocated to the various projects. You'll notice that we've got the telephone account here. That account wasn't linked to any or the budget wasn't linked to any projects, so therefore it's unallocated. So unallocated would obviously appear if you have, for example, transactions that are processed but were not linked to projects. They would be classified as unallocated. Right, so as you can see, a couple of reports you can make use of just to check your budget details as well as your project budgets if necessary, and just see how that process is progressing. Right, so I think what's important to understand is that how vital budgets are within any organization. Obviously, sales budgets are important, expense budgets are important to control those expenses and increase your sales. But we also have another aspect which is called Capex budgets. Now, we obviously know how important fixed assets are to an organization. And in essence is that most organizations wouldn't really exist without fixed assets. So, of course, they're obviously used to generate revenue for the organization and are used in the day-to-day running of the company. Now, just as we have budgeting for financial aspects, we also are able to implement budgets for your fixed assets. And obviously, because they're a vital cog to your organization, it's always important that you've got budget for them, make sure that you're purchasing them at the right times, etc. And we've then got something called Capex budgeting, and that can be found under the fixed assets module. And if you go in there, we've got the option to use Capex budgets. Now, fixed assets can be used as a standalone, or it can incorporate into your evolution, and you can obviously allocate depreciation, etc., to your evolution financials. So the Capex budgeting is really based on 2 platforms. We're firstly going to set up our budget, and then after that, we're then going to go link an order to the budget, and then finally, we're then going to go link an asset to a Capex order. So first, on the Capex budgets, we're going to go through to set one up, and we're then going to say what this budget for. For example, okay, and then the capitalization date is simply the date when the budget becomes effective. So I'm just going to say from the first period of my financial year, and is this for replacement on new items? And very importantly, the asset type that this budget refers to. Right, so I'm going to just say, now what needs to happen now is we're just going to save this record, and we're going to implement something called a phasing in period. So you may have been allocated a certain amount of funds to purchase your fixed assets. However, you want to phase them in over your financial year. So I'm going to say, for example, we can do a phasing in period here, where I'm going to specify exactly how I'm going to spend that money and how frequently I'm going to spend it. So just say, right, so I'm saying is that from January, I'm going to be spending an amount of 300,000. Right, then I'm going to add another phase, which is going to be starting from perhaps, for example, April. It's going to be and then I'm going to add a third one from August. Right, so it tells me that the total budget for new furniture is going to be 700,000. It's going to be phased in over those 3 periods with those values. Okay, always go edit those values and clear them if I need to, but I've got my budget set up there and I'm good to go. Right, now the next phase is going to be obviously the purchasing of the items. So once the budget has been set up, I can now give the go ahead to, for example, the purchasing department to go purchase those assets. And they then would obviously complete a Capex order. And I can then go and there's my PO, which I'm going to send to my supplier for the purchasing of my relevant assets. And very importantly, I just need to go link that order to a budget. So there we go, I'm going to link it to my budget. And right, very importantly, the date when this transaction took place. Okay, and the amount. Let's just right, so currently now it's going to give me details of the Capex order that was placed with my supplier, and I can continue. So once again, we're linking Capex order to a budget. Okay, and then finally, when the asset is delivered by the supplier, I then need to go capture those details within my asset register. So when the asset does arrive, the financial side will be handled by the accounting side, for example, paying the supplier. updating the GL, etc. And now I just need to capture this information of the new asset within my asset register. So I'm going to go to assets, and I'm going to add the details there, and just say, for example, right. So now I'm just going to specify the asset type that I've got, and very importantly, I now need to go link the asset to a Capex order. So on the drop down, I've got the order details over there, order number, order description, etc. And just complete the asset information by specifying purchase date and then the value. Right, and we're good to go. So I've linked the asset to the asset type together to the Capex order, no problem there. And we're good to go. Now, within the Capex reporting, we've got a couple of reports we can have a look at just to see details of our budget. So if I go to my reports, Capex cash flow forecast, if I open up that, I'm just going to specify from the beginning of the financial year. And if I preview that, it's going to give me a breakdown of how the budget has been set up based on my financial periods and the budget amounts for those periods. Right, so that's our Capex cash flow forecast report. We then have a Capex detail report. And let's just, that's correct, let's just go and run that. And as you can see, it tells me exactly what has been purchased. I've got the budgeted amount there. I've committed that amount, 175. I've spent that value, and my balance for that period is 125. So a breakdown of exact budget values, how much has been spent, and how much do I have still to spend on that budget. Right, and then we have Capex purchases, which is going to give us details of what we've bought. Right, so it gives me details of what I've purchased, the order details, etc. So I just want to see what my purchases were for a certain period. In this report there, and I can see that information. Right, and then we've got the Capex summary, which is going to give us details right, there's my details once again, the amount of the budget, committed amount, the balance, etc., and a breakdown there in a summary format. So as you can see, a whole range of reports that you can make use of in order to track your Capex budget expenditure. Right, so very importantly, just to handle that correctly, ensure that you keep tabs on what you're spending on your fixed assets, how you're spending your budget, and ensure that the process is followed through on your fixed assets register. So as you can see, it really is, in regards to budgeting, we've got the whole financial aspect where you've got projects which can link to budgets. We've got the ability to show your variances, variance percentages, etc. Keep stringent tabs on your budget, what you've spent, and the reports will tell you exactly how much you've spent, have you overspent, do you still have enough funds to spend, and very importantly, we've got the ability to implement the validation of budgets to ensure that transactions are not processed which are going to exceed our budget values. And then coming to the Capex side, just once again, maintaining or controlling the purchases of your fixed assets based on the budget with the order, and ensure that information is updated within your asset register. Right, so that's a wrap from me. Thank you so much for attending and being part of the webinar. I do hope this webinar has been useful. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Goodbye. It's over and out.